Imagine working your whole life beside your father, only for him to sell the one thing you truly owned, your $1 million lakeside cottage, and then toss you a $15,000 check like that would cover the wreckage he left behind. That's my story. Stick with me while I share what happened. And if it touches you, don't forget to support our channel by hitting that subscribe button, dropping a like, and sharing it with the people you care about. My name is Lila Mercer. I'm in my late 20s, and I've never been a stranger to hard work. I grew up around that cottage, hammering nails with my dad when I was barely old enough to lift the toolbox, pulling weeds from the shore, and repainting the old dock every summer. What made it special wasn't just the sweat we poured into it, but the love behind it. My mom used her inheritance to build it, and after she passed, it became the one place where I could still feel close to her. The smell of the cedar beams, the sound of the lake lapping against the rocks, even the chipped stone fireplace, all of it carried her memory. It wasn't just property. It was her legacy, and it was mine. But my father never saw it that way. Dale Mercer was the kind of man who could look at a sunset and only calculate the price of the land it set over. He treated sentiment like weakness, and anytime I got emotional, he'd roll his eyes or call me dramatic. So when I found out what he'd done, it wasn't just shocking, it was soul-crushing. I remember the moment with perfect clarity. He called me over like it was nothing, slid an envelope across the table, and said, "Here. This is more than fair." Inside was a check for $15,000. I thought it was some kind of joke until he explained. My cottage, was gone. Sold. Just like that. He hadn't asked, hadn't warned me, hadn't even considered what it meant to me. My chest caved in. My hands shook. I couldn't breathe. I tried to speak, but the words jammed in my throat. Anger, grief, disbelief. They all collided inside me until I couldn't tell which hurt more. That check felt like blood money, an insult dressed as generosity. I had lost the last real piece of my mother, and he expected me to thank him for it. That was the moment something inside me snapped. Every corner of that lakeside place carried a story. I could close my eyes and hear my mom's laughter as she steadied my little hands around a fishing pole, patient as I tangled the line again and again. I could still feel the shock of cold water on the first day she taught me how to swim, her arms open and waiting when I kicked toward her. Evenings meant cousins gathered around a fire, sparks floating into the night sky while we roasted marshmallows until they caught flame. Those memories weren't just sweet, they were stitched into me. The cottage wasn't a vacation house. It was the backdrop of my childhood, the safest space I had ever known. When I was younger, my father had a way of making promises sound like laws written in stone. He'd tell me, "One day this will all be yours, Lila," pointing toward the lake as if he meant it. I believed him, because what child wouldn't? But looking back, I see how easily he bent his words when it suited him. For as long as I can remember, he had a habit of brushing aside anything I valued. If I wanted to share something that made me happy, he'd find a flaw in it. If I asked for help, he'd remind me how much of a burden I was. It wasn't new, it was just the first time the cost was unbearable. The truth that gnawed at me wasn't the money. I didn't care about market prices or what a sale could buy. What gutted me was knowing that the one place keeping my mom close had been stripped away without a second thought. He didn't just sell a house, he severed my connection to her. And the fact that he could look at me, hand me that check, and act like he was doing me a favor, that was the cut that wouldn't stop bleeding. For days I tried to swallow it, to tell myself there was nothing I could do, but the more I replayed it, the harder it became to stay silent. A voice inside me whispered louder every time I stared at that slip of paper. If he thought I'd take the insult, walk away quietly, and vanish from his life, then he didn't know me at all. That was the moment I knew. I would fight back. I couldn't carry the silence anymore. I stormed into his kitchen, the check clenched so tightly in my hand it was crumpled by the time I dropped it on the table. "You sold it," I said, my voice breaking between rage and disbelief. His response was a shrug, like I was making a fuss over spilled milk. He told me I was overreacting, that I always let feelings cloud my judgment. He leaned back in his chair, acting as though he'd done something noble, insisting the cash he gave me was more than I'd ever see otherwise. Hearing him dismiss me that way ignited something raw. I told him straight that the property wasn't just another asset. It was worth close to $1 million. My words barely left my mouth before he smirked, waving off the number like it was nothing but fantasy. He reminded me, in that patronizing tone he'd perfected over the years, that I didn't have the resources to challenge him. According to him, The sale was final, and I should be thankful for what he called his generosity. I pressed harder, pointing out that he had no right to make that decision without me. Instead of listening, he twisted it back on me, saying I was selfish, that I didn't understand the pressure he was under. It was classic him, turning his betrayal into my fault, painting me as unreasonable just to soothe his own conscience. Every word out of his mouth dripped with contempt, like he enjoyed watching me break under the weight of his betrayal. When I realized nothing I said would crack his armor, I stopped. Standing there, I felt heat crawl up my neck, but beneath the fury was a steadier current. I knew I wouldn't win with shouting. He thrived on making me small, and walking away was the only way to cut off his performance. So I left, not because I accepted defeat, but because I felt something new stirring inside me. It wasn't just grief anymore, it was resolve, sharp and unyielding. For the first time, I saw the situation clearly. If I was going to reclaim what mattered, I couldn't do it on his terms. I would need to find another way, and I would. The not knowing ate at me until I finally forced myself to dig for answers. I scrolled through county records, cross-checking documents late into the night until a name appeared: Ryan and Claire Hastings. Strangers. People who had no connection to me, no history on that shoreline, no memories woven into the walls. Just wealthy newcomers who could treat the place as another trophy. Curiosity turned into obsession. I drove by one weekend, my hands shaking as I parked down the road. The sight nearly knocked the air out of my lungs. A dumpster sat in the driveway, overflowing with torn wood and plaster. Workers carried out beams, ripped up flooring, and stacked the stones from the old fireplace like they were nothing but rubble. The swing my mom had hung near the porch was gone, replaced by scaffolding. Piece by piece, every trace of her was being erased under the sound of drills and hammers. I stood there hidden, my throat burning, trying not to scream. It wasn't their fault. They didn't know the meaning of what they were destroying. But knowing my father had handed it over so easily made my stomach twist. That cottage was never just a building. Watching strangers get it felt like losing her all over again, except this time it was permanent. Later, when I pulled up the sale records again, the truth hit even harder. He hadn't just given it away. He'd walked away with over $900,000. A fortune, while I was left clutching a scrap of paper that barely covered rent for a few months. The cruelty wasn't just in the sale. It was in the way he profited while pretending I should be grateful. That night I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, anger carving itself into something sharper. The image of him basking in his windfall, while I drowned in grief, hardened inside me. He thought he could silence me with a token check and live large off what never belonged to him. If that was his calculation, he was about to learn how wrong he was. I didn't know the how yet, but one thing was certain. I would make him choke on every dollar he thought he'd stolen from me. News about him traveled faster than I wanted. Suddenly, he was the man everyone noticed, rolling into town behind the wheel of a gleaming pickup that still smelled like the dealership. I'd pass by a restaurant window and there he'd be, laughing too loudly at a table spread with steaks and bottles of wine. A silk tie knotted at his neck like he'd stepped out of a catalog. He wore his fortune on his sleeve, making sure people saw how well he was doing. My reality couldn't have been more different. I was still pulling doubles at the diner, balancing plates on aching arms, praying tips would stretch enough to cover another month's rent. The sound of coins clinking in my jar at home became my nightly reminder of how wide the gap had grown between us. Every shift I worked, every bill I struggled to pay, only deepened the sting of what he'd taken. I stopped answering his calls, then stopped returning messages altogether. The silence between us stretched, but I found I preferred it. I couldn't stomach hearing his voice dripping with self-satisfaction, not when every word reminded me of what I'd lost. Walking away from him wasn't just about survival. It was the only way to keep myself from drowning in bitterness. When word of the fallout reached the rest of the family, the reaction was like another slap. Instead of outrage, I heard whispers that I should count myself lucky he gave me anything at all. Some even praised his generosity, insisting $15,000 was more than most parents would hand their grown daughter. Their judgment cut deep, but I knew arguing would be useless. They saw only the surface, his shiny purchases, his polished image. They didn't see the rot underneath. So I pulled back, drawing a line around myself, keeping company with the quiet. The loneliness was heavy, but beneath it something hotter pulsed. Each slight, each dismissive comment, each smug glance from him when our paths accidentally crossed only added fuel to the fire. I wasn't broken, not completely. I was waiting, letting the anger harden into something sharper. He thought the story was over, but I was already writing the next chapter in silence. One evening, while I was closing up at the diner, a familiar face walked in. Frank Delaney, a man with kind eyes and silver hair, had been a close friend of my mom's years ago. He was retired now, but people in town still spoke of him with respect. Once a sharp lawyer, always a sharp mind. He asked how I'd been, and something in his tone made me sit down and tell him everything. I expected polite sympathy, maybe a pat on the shoulder, but instead he leaned forward, listening with a seriousness that unsettled me. When I finished, he stayed quiet for a moment, then said something that made my pulse spike. "Lila, if that house was tied to your mother's estate, your father may not have had the right to sell it." The words hung in the air, heavy, dangerous, and yet suddenly everything shifted. I had spent so long believing he held all the power, that what he'd done was unshakable. But Frank didn't speak like someone offering false hope. He spoke like a man who knew the ground rules. He explained that property attached to a will wasn't his to touch without clear authority, and if my mom had set terms, those terms mattered. For the first time, a crack appeared in the wall I thought was unbreakable. Frank urged me to start digging. "Look for old files, bank records, the original will. Anything that proves her intentions," he said. His calm guidance steadied me, and for the first time in months I didn't feel powerless. Walking home that night, the street lamps glowing against the pavement, my thoughts wouldn't slow down. If what Frank suggested was true, the sale wasn't just cruel, it might have been unlawful. That meant his empire, his image, his smug laughter could all collapse under the weight of what he'd done. The idea electrified me. The pain hadn't vanished, but something new took root. Possibility. I no longer felt like a daughter left behind. I felt like someone holding the edge of a weapon she hadn't realized she possessed. For the first time since losing the cottage, I had leverage, and I intended to use it. I spent nights hunched over dusty boxes stacked in the back of the attic, air thick with the smell of paper and old wood. My hands trembled as I sifted through yellowed folders, brittle envelopes, and faded photographs. Hours passed before I uncovered the document I'd almost stopped believing existed. My mother's will, tucked neatly inside a folder labeled in her handwriting. Reading the words sent a chill through me. Clear as daylight, she had left the cottage to me. No ambiguity, no loophole. It was mine. The realization struck like lightning. He hadn't just betrayed me emotionally, he had crossed a legal boundary. That knowledge settled in my chest like a steady flame. All the gaslighting, all the dismissals, every mocking smile, suddenly I had the proof to cut through it. I didn't stop there. With Frank's guidance, I traced the sale through bank records, gathering statements that showed exactly what he pocketed. The numbers told their own story. Hundreds of thousands transferred, luxury purchases made almost immediately afterward. It wasn't just that he sold what wasn't his. He burned through the proceeds without hesitation. Every line on those statements fueled my resolve. I worked quietly, keeping my movements hidden. While the town admired his new lifestyle, I was building a case brick by brick, grief sharpening into determination. I copied every relevant page, organized them into binders, and tucked them away where no one could reach. Each page felt like armor, protecting me from the despair that had once swallowed me whole. With Frank's steady encouragement, I reached out to a practicing lawyer he trusted. Sitting in that office, sliding the evidence across the polished desk, I felt my heartbeat pound against my ribs. For once, I wasn't walking in as a broken daughter. I was stepping into the role of someone ready to fight. We began shaping the strategy, not just to recover what had been stolen, but to drag the truth into daylight. If my father had gambled on me staying quiet, he had miscalculated. This wasn't going to be a whispered family dispute. It was going to be a battle fought where everyone could see exactly who he really was. The day of the hearing felt unreal, like I was stepping into someone else's life. Dale arrived in a pressed suit, polished shoes gleaming, his expression dripping with confidence. He carried himself as though the outcome was already written in his favor, shaking hands with acquaintances, flashing that same smile he always used to win people over. Watching him, I felt a wave of nausea, but beneath it was something stronger, resolve. When it was my turn to speak, my hands trembled only for a moment before steadying around the folder I had prepared. I laid out the chain of evidence carefully. My mother's written instructions, the records of the sale, the proof of how the funds had been spent. Every page I handed forward made his smirk falter, if only for a heartbeat. Still, he tried to keep his composure, leaning back as though he were unbothered. Then came his turn. He stood, voice booming, and painted me as hysterical, ungrateful, a daughter inventing grievances to punish a parent who had done his best. He even suggested I wasn't mentally stable, tossing out barbs designed to rattle me. For a few tense moments, I worried the performance might sway the room. But the documents spoke louder than his theatrics. The clarity of my mother's words on paper cut through every lie he tried to spin. The judge's expression hardened as the pieces fell into place. When the decision came, it landed like a hammer. The cottage had never been his to sell. The transaction was invalid, and he was ordered to return the full amount he had gained. For a second, the courtroom was silent except for the scratching of pens, but I only saw his face, jaw tight, color draining, eyes wide with disbelief. Humiliation clung to him as he realized the walls had closed in. No charm, no manipulation could undo the truth laid bare before everyone present. I felt a rush of something almost indescribable, not joy exactly, but a fierce relief. For so long he had convinced me I was powerless. Now he was the one cornered, stripped of every excuse. The balance had shifted, and he knew it. Word traveled quickly once the verdict became public. The man who once paraded through town with a grin and a new truck now walked with his head lowered, whispers following wherever he went. Neighbors who once praised him now crossed the street, unwilling to be seen at his side. The image he had built so carefully cracked overnight, replaced by the truth. He wasn't a success story, but a cheat. The judgment forced his hand. One by one, the symbols of his vanity disappeared. The gleaming vehicle vanished from the driveway, followed by the tailored wardrobe and the nights out at expensive restaurants. What he once flaunted as proof of his superiority was stripped away piece by piece, until he was left with nothing but the consequences he had earned. Meanwhile, I stood on the opposite path. With the funds returned, I reached out to the Hastings. They had no appetite for ongoing conflict and quickly agreed to release the property. Signing the papers that transferred it back into my name felt like breathing after months underwater. When I walked through the doorway again, I found it altered by their renovations, but beneath the changes the soul of the place remained. Slowly, I began to restore it, repairing what had been torn apart, bringing back small details that honored my mother's memory. Each nail driven, each brushstroke, felt like reclaiming more than walls and windows. It was reclaiming her presence. Inevitably, he appeared one afternoon, his pride eroded, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. He spoke of mistakes, of wanting to mend what was broken, of wishing for another chance. His words were heavy with desperation, but they rang hollow. I looked at him, the man who had once promised me safety and instead sold me out, and I felt no urge to ease his guilt. "You had your chance to be my dad," I told him, steady and unshaken. "Now you're just a man who traded me away." The silence that followed stretched wide, and for the first time, it was him who had no answer. I turned back to the cottage, leaving him outside, alone with the weight of what he had lost. I sat on the porch steps, the boards warm beneath me, staring out at the water as the last light of day scattered across its surface. The shoreline felt different now, quieter, yet the silence carried a sense of peace I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't about bank accounts or court rulings anymore. It was about holding on to what truly mattered. The cottage was mine again, not because of a transaction, but because I fought to reclaim what should never have been taken. I planted flowers where my mom once kept her garden, patched the dock, and hung a lantern by the window the way she used to. Every small act was a way of keeping her here, of weaving her love back into the walls and air. It wasn't restoration of a building. It was restoration of memory. Far away, he sat in a life stripped bare, resentment his only companion. Cut off from me, from respect, from the fortune he flaunted, all that remained was emptiness. He had gambled on my silence and lost. As I leaned back against the railing, the evening breeze lifting my hair, I let the truth settle in. He thought $15,000 would erase me. Instead, it cost him everything. Do you think I did the right thing by cutting him off, or should I have given him another chance? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories like mine.